Hey guys, what's up? If you look at James Bond 007 or any of the espionage stories like Jason Bourne or anything that's like spy related, espionage related, all of the movies in espionage are basically fantasy espionage, which means like, it's an espionage kind of story. It's an espionage genre where it's a spy and it's spy organizations and there's villains and all kinds of like secret agents and whatever it is, But most of it is like it's fantasy. They put a lot of fantasy into it, and I think that if they just did like espionage fiction, it wouldn't be as good as espionage fantasy because you could tell that like James Bond is a fantasy figure. There's just no way anyone like a real spy doesn't look like James Bond or act like James Bond. Somebody who basically survives everything, knows how to fly like helicopters and airplanes and motorcycles and, like is very, very coquettish and whatever it is, always like ends up meeting women and things like that, It's interesting because like people watch it, but because it's fun, it's a fun espionage thriller. But the thing is, it's mostly fantasy. And I think that's a lot of like the modern day fictions have some fantasy elements in it. He's not necessarily a superhero, but he's also got kind of like powers. Like you can't bring him down. He's he's more of like a super spy than a regular spy, and even like now, I don't know if like the best spies in the world are like that or if it's just pure fantasy, but I really do think that if the best spies in the world are like that, you probably wouldn't know anything about them, right? The person who wrote all of the different James Bond stories, they probably like didn't know the actual person that's sort of like that, because they take it and they just put it up on, they just pump it up to such a degree. And it's fun. It works great as a movie. It works great as a book, as a novel. But they pump it up to such a degree where common stories like espionage stories become espionage fantasy. If you look at Jason Bourne, like the Bourne Identity, the Bourne Ultimatum, all that stuff, you look at that movie, you'll see that like basically he basically takes on the whole spy organization and wins. He's got like hundreds of spies against them, and he's like alone, and he still beats all of them. It's sort of like sort of like Rambo. When you look at Rambo, there was the first Rambo movie, but then if you look at the further Rambo movies, Rambo went into war in, I'm not sure where the movie was taking place, some place that looked like Vietnam or maybe some kind of place like that. It was jungles, it was like forests and whatever. And single-handedly, he took down like the whole army. That's pure fantasy. It's interesting because do people like stories more when there's fantasy elements in the story, right? Because every time people tell a story, they have to make it a tall tale. Something like more than it was, Was there really a King Arthur? Was there really an Excalibur, Or was the story told about something that might have happened, just pumped up to be sort of like fantasy based? Maybe there was a King Arthur, maybe he had a sword, but the story says he had a magic sword, Was there Lancelot, who was a knight of the Round Table? Maybe not, but the story says he was the greatest knight of all time. Was there a what was the Holy Grail? Did that even exist, or was it something that they just pumped up to be amazing? Like whoever drinks from the Holy Grail gets a renewal of life, or gets extra life, or something like that, gets blessed, or gets powers, or whatever it is. It's interesting how people take tales and they make them a little bit more by putting fantasy elements in it. I think almost every story that is told has some fantasy elements in it. Not all the stories, but a lot of stories. It's just because they want to tell these tales in a tall way. Something happens and people just make up other stuff to put it in that story. If you look at like the first stories ever told, they were fantasy stories. If you looked at the first, like Gilgamesh, the Epic of Gilgamesh was the Babylonian tale or something like that. Those old cities back in those days, with the sculptures, you see them, you see them in the museums and stuff like that. The old Babylonian, Sumerian sculptures. They wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it was basically a fantasy tale. Now, the thing about like back then is they believed in all of these fantasy elements as real. They believed in dragons. They believed in magic weapons, magic swords, magic powers, whatever it is. All of these different things, like things that were mythological, were very real to them. They believed in all of that. And so now when you look at that story, it's just like, well, if you put swords and magic swords and mythology and, quests and, superpowered beings and whatever it is, put that together, you get a fantasy story. Like right now, we look back at Beowulf as a fantasy story. But what's interesting about it is that Beowulf, whether the story was based on anything real, was basically taken from an old Norse tale, And so was there an actual story behind it? Or was that story, because it was told generation after generation from one person to the next, they just, like the people telling the stories, just wanted to make the story more interesting. So they put magic items in there, monsters, heroes, and things like that. And I think they did the same thing with James Bond. They made him like a super like power. Like they made him like a superhero, basically. It's like, you could say, he's not like a real, like not a proper superhero. He's not Superman or Batman or any of that stuff. But he does have a secret identity, right? And basically he will take down villains that are kind of like super villains. I mean, what's interesting about like the James Bond stories is that like, it's not, he maybe has some kind of like super powered influence stuff, but he's after these villains who are also kind of super villains. You know what I mean? So they take like a story, like an espionage story, and they just put it up on Overload, where it's like someone, you can't have, like, if you look at the car chases and the motorcycle chases and the boat chases, going through streets backwards and flipping over cars and, just getting chased and, running away, or like shooting at a distance and whatever it is, or one person like taking down a whole bunch of, like, a whole army, a whole troop of people, whatever it is. It's interesting, but they put a lot of fantasy into it, and they put a lot of fantasy into most movies right now and most stories right now. There's just like fantasy, and a lot of people will say it's only fantasy if it's medieval-ish, medieval fantasy. They'll say like Harry Potter's fantasy, But Harry Potter's fantasy, but it's also like a Cinderella tale, at the same time, where this kid that doesn't think anything about him turns out that he's special in some way. It's interesting. It's really, really interesting. A kid that never thought anything about that was special about his life, that he's actually special in some way. It's an interesting story that way, but you would call that fantasy because there's magic involved, and witches, witchcraft, warlocks, monsters, beings, and like flying on broomsticks and whatever it is. You could call that fantasy based, but you can also call James Bond fantasy because the way he fights with other bad guys or gets chased across a city and like doesn't get caught and whatever it is, always wins in the end through odds that are just like innumerable, and it's not just espionage, it's not just James Bond. I think like a lot of stories, a lot of movies, they put a lot of fantasy in it. Not every movie has that. Not every movie has a lot of fantasy, but even comedies will have fantasy elements in the comedy because things that just like can't possibly happen. They happen, but in comedies they happen because they're funny. They put that in there, and it's absurd, it can't really happen, but if it's funny, it's a comedy. But if there's a lot of elements in the comedy that really isn't a reflection of reality, which would never happen in the real world, it's fantasy. And if you look at like romance novels, romance movies, or anything, any movie with romance lines in it, so either a romance movie or a movie with romance plots or romance elements in the plot. The romance is more or less a fantasy romance. Like, it might happen that way, but people usually don't know of actual people who had that same kind of romantic experience as somebody would have in a movie or a novel or a book. You know, so stories now, they basically put fantasy elements in it. You know, James Bond, I would say, is a fantasy hero. If you look at some other, like, something like The Punisher, right? You can watch Netflix. Netflix has The Punisher. You can check that out. It's a great series. You know, and he's like an ex-Marine, whatever. Yeah, it's understandable that he's trained and he knows how to take down villains, but he takes down like 10 people in the middle of a forest single-handedly with one shotgun, and you know, his hand is like broken and he ties it up with tape and whatever it is. You know, it's just like, it's so unreal that they make it fantasy, but I think otherwise people really wouldn't see that person as a hero. It's interesting because like the hero is sort of like there so people can identify with them. People want to be a hero. You know, they want to look at Superman or Batman or something and be like, oh, I want to do good things for society or people. You know, just to do good. You know, like Superman or like superheroes do that. But you know, like a lot of people will look at James Bond and say, well, that's how espionage is. You know, that's the spy game. That's how it is, and it's not. You know, it's obviously, there's a lot of fantasy elements in it. Obviously, he's way more powerful. He's way more smart. He's way more crafty. He has way more assets. He's way more like gadgets. The gadgets are unreal also. I mean, that's one of the things about James Bond is the gadgets don't exist. You know, the underwater like little thing that he breathes underwater does not exist. It's not an actual thing. The car with the machine guns and the oil slick and the you know, the just like jumps over a bridge and comes down the other side. You know, it's completely non-existent. But they take an espionage story and they put a lot of fantasy elements in it, and they create James Bond. They create the superhero based on partly espionage or espionage genre and mostly a lot of fantasy. So let me know what you guys are thinking in the comments about all this. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in another video later.